Hello, I'm Professor Richard Toye, and in this latest Centre of Imperial and Global History podcast, I'm talking to Dr. Ryan Hanley, whose previous book was called Beyond Slavery and Abolition, on Black British writing in the late 18th and early 19th century. And Ryan, you've got a new book project about working class attitudes to slavery during a similar period. Can you tell us more about it?
Yeah, sure. So we know a lot about the anti-slavery movements as a kind of mass political movement that mobilised people from across the spectrum of British society, from middle class organisers, evangelicals, down to the kind of common man on the street. But what we know about the culture of British anti-slavery tends to be largely based around kind of middle class cultural forms, the long form essay, operettas and theatre and stuff like that. My project is basically an attempt to understand what slavery looked like from the perspective of so-called, sort of ordinary working class Britons, people from poorer backgrounds living in these rapidly industrialising urban areas, and to perhaps just get a bit of a more nuanced and complete sense of popular responses to imperial issues like transatlantic slavery.
So the first question which immediately speaks to my mind is, what sources are you going to use to access these views?
Yeah, so obviously 18th and 19th century archives aren't really set up to record the perspectives or experiences of poorer people, much in the same way as they're not particularly well set up to record the experiences of the enslaved. So one of the routes into this project or into these ideas is around very cheap print culture, so sort of penny chapbooks and broadsides, looking at some of the urban street ballads around imperial issues and around this question of slavery. And this gives us a perspective, not of a sort of culture that's exclusively consumed by poorer people, but one that they could access even if they've got limited literacy, for example, in the case of broadside ballads. So that's the type of very cheap, very low status kind of cultures that I'm interested in, just to try to get at this question about what poorer people thought about slavery.
And how much of that stuff is there?
A surprisingly large amount, and it's surprisingly accessible. So I've been using, for instance, the Bodleian Library's Broadsides digital archive. At the National Library of Scotland, there's a large collection of very well preserved kind of penny chapbooks. So the from the ballads and broadsides collection, I've got about 130 different examples of songs, popular songs or very short narratives that are really cheap about transatlantic slavery.
So give me an example of a kind of a ballad, or kind of the themes of the ballads which might address some of these questions.
So one example I found really surprising was a ballad published in about 1804, 1805 called Liverpool Town. And it follows this kind of a traditional kind of ballad structure about a poor man who is trepanned into into naval service, into working aboard a ship. Usually that's about naval service, but in this case it's service aboard a West Indiaman slave ship. What I think is really unique about really interesting about the Liverpool Town ballad is that it recounts a slave insurrection that the heroic working class sailor in it helps to suppress. And so it contains a really kind of complicated engagement with this issue of slavery, because it's told from the perspective of somebody who is essentially a slave trader involved in the slave trade against his own will. It's kind of brought into violent contact with Africans, in this kind of unusual circumstance. But it's a romanticized ballad, about pining after his lost love back in Liverpool Town. So it's a fascinating kind of artifact.
So, I mean, I guess what that obviously shows is that although one might like to imagine that the working classes were against slavery and were campaigning against it, clearly quite a lot of them probably weren't and might have felt very differently.
Yeah, so I'm sort of writing in response to what is, in my view, a perhaps slightly romanticized narrative about working class responses to the question of slavery. I think we've kind of fondly imagined that, the opposition to slavery was very popular among poorer people because poorer people could imagine themselves in the position of the enslaved more easily because they were also exploited. What I'm finding actually is a much more nuanced picture that's quite responsive to other issues that are important to working people. Things like, of course, the reform movement, but also evangelical Protestantism and the spread of Methodism in working class communities. I think basically the picture is very complicated. And I'm increasingly coming to the opinion that the idea of a kind of, heroic and romanticized working class who were naturally opposed to all forms of tyranny and slavery isn't really sustainable, and that we need to maybe acknowledge some of those complexities and difficult aspects of British social history a bit more fully.
So, sort of coming back to some older but still very influential historiography, E.P. Thompson's Making the English Working Class, published back in 1963, that's been criticised sometimes for sort of not acknowledging some of the sort of conservative views of the working class. So your work kind of plays into that theme.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's not purely a story of, an undifferentiated kind of racist white working class. But I think it does kind of call into question the notion of working class cosmopolitanism that's been kind of heavily sort of popularized in certain accounts of British and Atlantic social history. So, we get the image of the kind of working class solidarity with the enslaved from work by Robin Blackburn or Marcus Rediker and Peter Limeball, which are all very fantastic interventions, on the historiography of abolitionism. But it's really to try to get a bit of a fuller sense of the range of working class responses, both kind of radical and perhaps conservative or loyalist, I suppose. The church and crown kind of working class cultures as well.
So this is a relatively new project, but when can we hope to see your new book?
That's a very good question. Well, hopefully in the next year or two. So I'm looking to put together the abstract for submission to the press during this calendar year, and then to finish the manuscript hopefully next year. So not too long, I hope.
Excellent. Well, we're all looking forward to it. Ryan Hanley, thank you very much.